As you may have seen, the channel recently passed another huge milestone, 200,000 subscribers. As ever, I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who supported the channel by watching, liking, commenting and subscribing. It all means a huge amount to me. But I'm particularly grateful to all the members who so generously supported the channel. Their regular contributions have made all the difference. And if you'd also like to help, I put a link above and in the description below. Anyway, as I try to do on these occasions, I've put together a Q&A video. I really hope you enjoy it, and I'll post the second part next week, so keep an eye out for that. Ryan Prudente asks, with North Korea already being as isolated as it is, does North Korea see any meaningful international repercussions for sending troops to fight in Ukraine? So, Ryan, thanks a lot for this, because I think this raises such an interesting question about how does North Korea see the world anyway? I mean, this is the real problem that in many ways we're grappling with when we talk about North Korea. It is so alien and it's so insular and inward looking that it's very, very difficult to get a sense of how does the top leadership, how does Kim see the wider international implications of the decisions that he's making. So what would be his mindset as he goes in and makes this decision on sending troops to Russia to fight in Ukraine? Something that, you know, some say isn't actually happening, but I think there seems to be a lot of evidence to say that it is. So what I would say is that this actually touches on a really interesting point on how we think about international relations. And one of the things that I often say about when you do policy analysis is there's a wonderful saying that what people perceive to be real is real in its consequences. And this is one of, if you like, my three sort of basic principles of doing policy analysis. It's not what you know about a situation. It's not how you see the situation that matters. When you're trying to understand international relations, it's about trying to get into the head of the people making the decision, because it's how they see their reality. Whether it's right or wrong doesn't actually matter. It's how they see their reality, which will drive their decisions. And in a lot of cases, we can break down how they might see their reality. So it might not be how we would see their reality, but we can get into their heads and say, you know what, somebody from this country, given the factors of their neighbours, given the problems of their economy, this might be by what's driving their decisions in this particular area. And, you get into all sorts of interesting debates about rationality and reasonability. And I remember this was really powerful at the time of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, because a lot of people were saying, well, why doesn't Saddam Hussein throw open his doors and allow in weapons inspectors and everything like that? It's the logical thing to do. But it would mean losing face. And in many ways, there was also a sense that, he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but didn't want to admit that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, because that would carry all sorts of consequences, for the sense of, Iraq standing and things like that. So there were some really interesting debates about why particular countries behave in ways that might seem illogical to an outsider, but when you actually contextualize it, it makes a lot more sense. In the case of North Korea, again, it's just really difficult to try and make sense of what it is that Kim is trying to achieve, what he sees by this relationship with Russia. Maybe he feels that Russia does present an alternative alignment to the West, that Russia can take on the West and win, and that he wants to be on the side of that. Alternatively, he might realize that Russia is his best hope, that if Russia goes down and Putin goes down, and, then he's going to lose a vital supporter. So better to go in with them, rather than have that sort of complex relationship with China, which has traditionally been its supporter, but on the other hand, it comes with strings attached. So really all this is to say is it's really difficult to know exactly what the calculation that's going on in this area. But I think, what I would say is that this actually becomes a really interesting lesson for how we think about international relations and understanding, as I say, this idea that it's not the objective reality that matters. It's not how we see a situation that even matters. It's how the party concerned sees it, because that will drive the decisions that they make. And so we need to be thinking very much in those terms. But again, in some cases, such as North Korea, it's incredibly difficult to get inside the North Korean mindset. Chizag asks, if Hezbollah fails to push the Israeli military out of southern Lebanon, is it likely that Israel will attempt to permanently occupy and eventually annex southern Lebanon in a similar manner as the Golan Heights? My sense would be no, but we're living in such strange times at the moment that I wouldn't necessarily completely push it off the table. But overall, I think that I see it as very unlikely that it would go down that route. I think, obviously, Israel and Lebanon have a difficult relationship for all sorts of reasons. But it's a rather different relationship, I think, than the relationship between Israel and Syria. And there is a sort of a sense that Syria has traditionally represented an existential threat to Israel, and the Golan Heights were an area that Israel said we believe is so fundamental to our security that we're going to annex it. But it is important to highlight that its annexation was explicitly condemned by the UN Security Council. It runs contrary to international law. And it was one of the very, very few examples of annexation that existed prior to Russia's annexation of Crimea and then parts of eastern Ukraine. That what we actually saw is that in modern international relations, countries have tended to shy away from annexation. It's considered, a step too far. So Israel had done that with the Golan Heights, and I would have said certainly in the past that the chances of it doing that in southern Lebanon were absolutely nil. Yes, it faced the problem of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. We've seen that it's invaded twice before. Certainly there was in the early 1980s during the Lebanese Civil War. And I mean, that was a very, very complex situation in all sorts of ways. And then we saw in 2006, when it was fighting Hezbollah, there was a short war where it went into southern Lebanon and maintained a presence. I think that still is most likely to be the outcome. But of course, there is this sense that does Israel want to be in that situation, that it goes in, it drives out Hezbollah, it then withdraws, and then in a few years' time, what we're going to see is a resumed Hezbollah presence. And so I think there's going to be all sorts of questions about how that can be managed. One of the obvious answers would this be possible to be managed through a beefed up UN peacekeeping presence in southern Lebanon? And of course, for anyone following this, they'll know that that's an extremely sensitive issue at the moment, because obviously Israel has been going up against UNIFIL forces. And there's been sort of evidence that it's even sort of been, it's been attacking sort of posts saying that this is a cover for Hezbollah activity. So I think, what we're seeing at the moment, and especially with the current Israeli government in power, is that it could well just simply say, well, look, we will remain in southern Lebanon for as long as we feel that Hezbollah represents a threat, and it's going to be incumbent on Lebanon to deal with Hezbollah. But of course, anyone who knows the situation in Lebanon at the moment knows that this is highly unlikely. Hezbollah has a very, very strong position in the country, although a lot of people may be hoping that Israel will help to weaken that. But it's going to be a huge question, because I think looking at where we are now and what we've seen with Gaza and what we're seeing at the moment in Lebanon is a sense that Israel is saying we will do whatever we want in order to protect our security. And if that means violating international law, then so be it. And I think that that's one of those sort of things that sort of worries, observers, that maybe Israel would just simply turn around and say, well, look, we cannot guarantee our security without creating a buffer zone in southern Lebanon. We've been in before. We've pulled out every time Hezbollah's taken over again. So until that can be the case, we will remain in place. But it will be a long-term proposition, and it will come with all sorts of greater problems. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting to watch how this plays out. Now, it might be the case that, Israel believes that it can strike hard against Hezbollah and weaken it, and then it can withdraw and hope that it's going to be a few more years until something else happens. But I think in many ways, the really big issue here, of course, is the relationship between Israel and Iran. And, it almost seems at the moment that Israel's getting into a position where it's saying, look, we can keep firefighting issues such as Hamas and Hezbollah, but ultimately, until we take care of the regime in Tehran, which is sponsoring them, then we have no hope of being able to deal with them. So I think this is something that actually in many ways is the far greater fear, if you like, in many people's minds, that, Israel might be getting to that stage now where it's saying, what, we have to take more direct action against Iran, because this ultimately is the source of the problem. So it's a very, very worrying time. And but yeah, to come back to this question, I don't think it's likely, but I wouldn't say that it's as unlikely as it might have been 5 years ago. That we might well see Israel take steps to, if not annex it entirely, to certainly beef up its presence and keep a long-term presence on the ground. So certainly something to be watching in the coming weeks, months, and potentially years ahead. Peter Lonergan asks, do you think it would be possible for Cyprus to challenge the UK's sovereignty over the base areas in its territory using the precedents of the Chagos Islands case? And if so, is this likely to happen? So, Peter, look, really, really interesting question here. And obviously sort of one that has become really interesting because of the recent decision of the United Kingdom to hand over sovereignty of the Chagos Islands. I made a video on this. I will put a link up for anyone who hasn't seen it, which fully explains the background of the case. But there has been a lot of speculation of people sort of saying that, because Britain has given the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, then that's opened the way for them to do the same in lots of other places. And so people have been talking about the Falklands and Gibraltar. And in actual fact, the Chagos Island case has nothing to do with Gibraltar or Falklands. It rests on a very, very particular question of international law. And that is the question of, did colonial powers in the process of decolonization have the right to carve off parts of these colonial territories and retain them, especially if that retention was used for military purposes? And essentially, this was the issue that the Mauritian government took Britain to the International Court of Justice over, and the court ruled that it didn't. So the one other place that does potentially fall under this area are the sovereign base areas in Cyprus, which essentially, for anyone who doesn't know the background to the story, and I'd imagine most people don't, that essentially, so Cyprus was a British colonial territory. In the late 1950s, Britain agreed to give up Cyprus, and Cyprus would become an independent state, but Britain would retain two areas which would remain sovereign British territory. And they exist even to this day. And there has been discussions about whether, the Chagos Islands case could apply. And it was very interesting that when the case went before the International Court of Justice, Cyprus actually took part in the proceedings. It presented its case. So the Cypriot government has very clearly been watching this. Now, could the case have an effect? In a broad sense, yes. In a specific sense, no. Because one of the things that one realizes about international law is it comes down to precision, it comes down to detail. And the key arguments, and I accept that this is open to debate, and and I'd be very interested to hear, views of others who are watching this video as to what they think about it. But it comes down to the argument that a crucial element in the Chagos case and the Mauritian case for having the Chagos Islands returned to it was UN General Assembly Resolution 1514 in 1960, which essentially outlawed carving off territory. But this was passed after Cyprus became independent. So there's an argument to say that because Cyprus became independent and the bases were carved off before this resolution clearly stated that you can't do that, you can't apply that resolution to any analysis of the Cyprus case. So it's almost the international law equivalent of getting off on a technicality. Now it's a very, very complex issue, and it will be very interesting to see how what happens next, because quite clearly Cyprus has been watching this case with a lot of interest, and the example of the bases is the one and only example I can think of British colonial territories, former colonial territories, where this applies to. So again, it doesn't apply. What we saw with the Chagos Islands, whatever anyone says, doesn't apply to Gibraltar, doesn't apply to the Falkland Islands. Those were very, very different situations, completely different contexts. But this could potentially be one of it. So it's going to be very interesting to see, if anything does come of it. But certainly for people who are interested in international law and these sorts of disputes, this has been a really, really interesting development. And, what will be the knock-on effects? It's going to be interesting to see. Parahamsa Yogananda asks, considering that most national borders were historically shaped by war, why shouldn't Russia be permitted to alter its borders to end the current conflict? So what I would say here very clearly is that you're talking about a situation in the 19th century that we could all recognise was not healthy, that is not a world that we want to go back to, where countries feel that they can invade other countries and seize those territories. So you could say that, yes, but it was the case for hundreds of years that countries would march in and seize those, so what Russia is doing now is not terribly different from what took place in the past, except for the fact that we got to the end of the Second World War and in 1945 set up the UN Charter to say, this is precisely the world that we don't want to live in anymore. We don't want to live in a world where countries can just come in and say, you know what, we want this bit of territory, we're going to take it by force, and we can do it because we're the stronger partner. And you say that, why didn't other countries did it? Because they were respecting those rules that were put in place. And this is the rule that has now been fundamentally broken by Russia. Now, again, and it always comes up in these situations where people will say, but what about when the US went in and invaded Iraq? What about when NATO went into Kosovo? Yes, I accept that, those were violations of international law, as strictly understood, but they weren't annexations. The United States did not annex Iraq. There is no part of Iraq that remains under US sovereignty. So it's not the same. What we've seen in the case of Ukraine and Russia is essentially a land grab, an unprecedented land grab. All right, you could potentially argue cases such as Golan Heights, but, essentially this is a major piece of territory that has been taken by one sovereign state from the land of another, one UN Security Council permanent member sovereign state that's done that. And I think that this is hugely, hugely destabilizing. I think it's extremely worrying to see what has happened. And I think you actually, in many ways, your question raises, why it's so very disturbing, because this does take us back to a very, very different era of international relations that I think all of us would and should have hoped was over, that we weren't going to see this. We weren't going to see, that era that countries could march in and take territories. And most of the time, if they even had an idea to do it, it was never recognized because the Security Council would issue a very clear statement, this is not possible. But of course, Russia has been able to veto that as a permanent member of the Security Council. So I think, as I say, in many ways, you sort of answer your own question. There's a very good reason why we shouldn't be accepting what's going on, because it does take us into a very, very different time in international relations that I think none of us would really want to see a return to. So Fra 604 asks, any advice for new IR graduates, where to look for jobs, or maybe a bit of an insight into academia? As somebody, it's been quite a few years since I graduated, so I sort of appreciate, and in contacts with students, I'm very aware, how difficult it can be. And actually, it's always been very difficult for new graduates, sort of thinking a little bit about what they want to do. They've come out, they've got this degree in international relations, and what is the next step? I mean, what I would always say is it's about thinking what it is that you really want to be doing. I mean, a degree in international relations opens up so many avenues, and there are so many potential careers that in many ways it's much more important to know what it is that you want to do, what sort of person you are, and how you'd like to make best use of that. So, for example, it's a great background for journalism, for people who want to go off and follow a career in media and that side of things. But obviously, it's also a natural subject to have studied for people who want to go off and become diplomats, join the foreign service of their own countries, or perhaps work for international organizations. I mean, of course, these jobs are very often highly fought over. They're few and far between. So it's definitely worth having a backup plan for it. But there are so many jobs and opportunities where I think a background in international relations is really useful. And lots of companies, for example, to have that world view and go and work in sort of the business environment, for a lot of people that's exactly what they want to be doing. Some people actually just say, well, I'm really interested in what's going on in the world, but I don't necessarily want to have a career that's directly related to it, and so they go off and find other things that they might be interested in. So really, as I say, it comes back down to that question. It's really what you want to do, and where you see it going, that matters the most, because it just opens up so many different opportunities, and it's not just limited to going, as I say, and working as a diplomat or working in an international organization. I mean, there's lots and lots of charities, for example, that have a global perspective or a regional perspective, which I think they would find it really useful to have people with an IR background. So again, it really comes down, and this is the advice I give to people. It's not so much I can say this is what you should do with an IR degree. It's like, well, why did you want to study international relations in the first place? And what are the things you're really interested in? Where can you see yourself? And then start to say, right, okay, if you did IR because you want to be a diplomat, what are the steps then that you need to be taking in order to join the foreign ministry of your own country, or maybe go and work for an international organization? And that's those are the real questions that I think are much more useful for people to be asking themselves. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for now. I'll post the second part next week. In the meantime, here's another video that you might find helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.